Welcome back to Koine Corner. Before I get started today, I'd like to ask you a little favor. At the end of the video, if you could leave me some sort of a comment, any kind of feedback that you may feel comfortable with, so I could get a better sense of how I'm doing, whether I should continue, whether I need to adjust my sails with the prevailing winds. Whatever you think, you let me know, and I'll see what I can do about it. Thanks. All right, today we're looking at two verses from Luke chapter 14, verses 34 and 35, and they are packed with interesting words and ideas, but a lot of interpretation goes into the translation because of some of this vocabulary choice and structure. Luke, remember, is the only Gentile writer of the New Testament. He's a native Greek speaker, and his Greek is a little more complex and interesting than some of the other writers. And we'll see a little bit of that in today's passage. Let's dive in. Luke chapter 14, verse 34 from the English Standard Version. Salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? So the verse has three parts. We're going to take them one at a time. Let's look at the first one in Koine. Kalon un tohalas. Tohalas is salt in the nominative case, the subject. Kalon is also in the nominative case. It doesn't look like it because it's neuter. And so tohalas kalon, predicate nominative, and we have salt is good. But look at that little word in the middle there, un. The ESV doesn't translate the un, the therefore or then. It treats it more like the introduction of a quote. Usually you see hoti for that, but you can also use the un for that function. The trouble is the passage immediately preceding this one is Jesus speaking as well. So there's no need to introduce a quote. Everything preceding was a quote from Jesus. So here we need to address the un, the therefore, and find out what it's there for. But hold that thought. We'll get to it a little later. Salt is good is what we're told, and that seems like a strange little non sequitur. Salt is good, okay? Salt is good. But it's not a non sequitur, it's important, and let's carry on to the second part. Eon de kai tohalas moranthe. So, eon de, but if, also, kai, tohalas, the salt, should be made, moranthe, should be made insipid. So moranthe is a passive form of morino, to be made insipid or to be made dull-witted or to be made useless, ineffectual. It comes from the noun moros, and moros is the word we get our English word moron from. So this word is used to describe someone who is or something that is dull-witted, foolish when talking about a human. This used to actually be a medical diagnosis. If your IQ fell below a certain point, you were diagnosed as a moron. We don't use such harsh language anymore, but it was in fact a technical clinical term at one point. It's metaphorically used a lot to deal with sickness or weakness or a handicap or an injury that rendered someone ineffectual or deficient somehow, someone who is not useful. When used about food, it meant insipid or tasteless, something that had no savor to it. So look at what Jesus says. First he said salt is good, therefore salt is good. And now he says, but if the salt should also be made unsalty. So what's more useless than unsalty salt? Isn't saltiness the only reason we have an interest in salt? There are commentators who've said the real challenge here is salt, being just sodium and chloride, is almost impossible to render unsalty. There is some talk about blocks of salt lining the floors of big ovens in the Middle East and how over time with the heat, the salt could lose its saltiness. I suggest to you that none of that matters. That's a dead-end avenue because Jesus is almost certainly not that concerned with actual salt, and the salt is being used as a metaphor. So let's not get hung up on the details of unsalty salt, let's look at it as a metaphor for something else, which he'll get to for us, and think about the uselessness of unsalty salt. What's more useless than unsalty salt? What's dumber than moronic salt, moronte, salt that has been made insipid? Let's go on to the next part. Antini artu thesetai. In what way, antini, in what way shall it be restored? Future passive verb. In what way shall it be restored? Well, how would you restore unsalty salt? The only way to restore it is to make it salty again, right? Well, how could you possibly make unsalty salt, which seems like an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms, salty again? Would you take salty salt and add it to the unsalty salt so the unsalty salt could borrow saltiness from the salty salt? That seems like a waste, doesn't it? Wouldn't you just toss the unsalty salt and use the salty salt in its place? It just seems like the only reasonable thing. You ditch the unsalty salt and employ salt that is actually salty, because saltiness is why you got the salt in the first place. So the implication of the question is that there's nothing less useless, there's nothing more sort of unredeemable than unsalty salt. Because how on earth would you restore it to being salty? Let's go on to verse 35. It is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown away. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Also from the English Standard Version. So, use for the soil, salt is a great weed killer. We've heard about sowing the enemy's fields with salt so they can never grow food again, right? It keeps herbivore life down, not herbivore. It keeps vegetation from growing. There we go. And it's also good for keeping critters from growing larvae and so forth in a manure pile. Let's look at this in Koine. Ute eis gain, ute eis kaprion, eutheton estin. We'll start at the end. Eutheton, suitable, useful. Estin, it is. It is useful. Ute eis gain, neither for the soil, ute eis kaprion, nor for the manure. So a few years back, I told my granddaughter that for Christmas, I was getting her crap, and pardon the salty language. And she didn't believe me. I kept telling her that for weeks leading up to Christmas. You're getting crap for Christmas. And then when Christmas came, one of the things that I had gotten for her was I went to a local mineral store and bought coprolite, which is fossilized dinosaur poop. So that was my little fun way of telling my granddaughter that she was getting crap for Christmas, and in fact did. It was coprolite, a form of fossilized dinosaur poop. So you've heard the word coprophilia, perhaps, an unhealthy interest in human waste. Coprion is the word for manure, or in this case, because it's a neuter, it's a manure thing, a manure pile. We know that Luke is not unfamiliar with this term, because in the previous chapter, in chapter 13, verse 8, in another parable of Jesus, he talks about putting manure around the base of an unfruitful tree to fertilize it and get it to produce, to give it a chance. So we know that manure is useful, but here in this case we're told about salt that is so unuseful, it's not even useful for keeping the bugs down in a manure pile. Let's look at the next part. Exo balusin auto. They throw it out. They whom? Well, they are just a general impersonal term. Like, we say things like that. Well, they won't let you do that. Well, who are they? Anyone. No one reasonable would let you do that. Jesus says, salt that's so unsalty that it's insipid, moronte salt, is no good for the soil nor the manure pile. The generic they, would just chuck it, would just get rid of it. It's that useless. You would discard such salt. We get to the third part where he says, ho ekon ota akuein akueto. The one having ears, the one who has ears, ho ekon ota, to hear, akuein, let him hear, akueto. So you've been to the doctor, he's looked in your ears with that little light that he stares through. That's called an otoscope. He looks into your oda with that, your ears, with his otoscope. An otologist is an ear doctor. And so Jesus says, the one who has ears to hear, let him hear. So he's telling them that if they're capable of getting it, if they hear what he's saying about the salt and extrapolating from it to something more important than salt, they'll get the message. So the salt talk isn't about salt at all. It's metaphoric, because all this salt stuff is incredibly self-evident. If you had a shaker full of salt on your table and it had no salty taste, you would replace it with other salt. It's useless to you. It doesn't serve its purpose. It's become insipid. It's moronic salt. Chuck it. So he says, if you have ears to hear, you'll get it, you'll understand it, and you'll be ready to carry on. Remember earlier I said about verse 34 that there was an a therefore, that we had to see what it was there for. Let's do that. So in that earlier clause, just before this salt soliloquy, Jesus talked about being a disciple. He turned to the crowd that was following him and he said, if any of you want to come along and be my disciple, there are some things that you need to know about that. This is in Luke 14, verse 25 through 33. You should go back and read it for yourself. But he says in there that the cost of becoming a disciple means it's so high that it may cost you your familial relationships. You've got to be prepared to hate father and mother, siblings, children. You've got to be prepared to put everything on a lower rung than discipleship if you want to pursue this path. He even says, this is so demanding it could cost you your very life. You may have to take up your cross and follow me in that manner as well. From there, he goes on to use two analogies. He says, no one sets out to build a tower to take on a big project, an undertaking, without first making sure he has the resources to see it to completion. He also then says, no king goes off to war without making sure that he has the necessary troops, the requisite resources to come out victorious at the end. Don't start something you're not prepared to finish. Don't go into something unless you understand the cost first. Therefore, verse 34, once you understand the cost of discipleship and the challenge, and you've weighed out the cost, don't go into it unless you can go the whole way, because otherwise you'll be like that unsalty salt. You'll be like salt that doesn't possess its necessary and valued quality in the first place. Unsalty salt is self-evidently useless, and it just gets tossed out. It's not even fit for the manure pile. That's what the therefore is there for, to connect the salt metaphor. Salt is good, but only if it's salty, only if it's useful, only if it's fit to complete the task. If it isn't, people just chuck it. So don't get started on this discipleship road unless you've counted the cost and you understand it, that you've planned ahead and seen what the end of this thing looks like, and that you're prepared to go the whole way. Otherwise, you won't be like good salt, you'll be like unsalty salt, and you can't make unsalty salt salty again. It gets chucked. It's not fit for the soil nor for the manure pile, and if you have ears to hear, Jesus says, hear and understand and count the cost, and don't wind up being moronic salt that's not even fit for the manure pile. Awesome, powerful stuff. Thanks for sticking around to the end. Please leave a comment, hit like, subscribe, share, all that good stuff. And until we see each other again, Charis Kai Orene Humin, grace and peace to you.